So this is the first time we've had a chance to talk together, William, and I'm quite excited. You reached out to me, I think, after seeing some of my recordings about Ammon Hillman, or perhaps the conversation that I had with him recently.
Yeah, you had a conversation a month or two ago, I guess it was, with him, and um, I mean, I was very impressed with your ability to take in what he says and kind of condense it into a single sentence and understand it. And so, you seemed, just brilliantly intuitive about language and some of the things that I think he was even struggling to express. You seem to understand it, and I think that was. I was kind of hoping that maybe you'd have some understanding of what I was seeing and thinking. And it seems like that you not only understand it, but have experienced some of it as well. So that's kind of makes it a unique conversation. So I'm very glad that you were willing to talk to me and stuff. So.
Oh, I'm super excited to talk to you. You're one of the only people who seems to have had this kind of intuition that there's something underlying all the linguistic systems that humans use that could conceivably link them together or demonstrate a kind of a root of origin or concern that I don't think. Obviously, there's been tens of thousands of people who've looked into the origins of language in humans and the origins of writing and so forth. It would be, I think, premature to suppose that none of them had a similar intuition. I'm sure many people have had an intuition like that, or just a sense, or even have discovered something. But I'm not aware of very many of them. It's an uncommon thing when someone uh, sort of runs the flag up the flagpole that says, "Hey, there's something here that's being overlooked," right? That we're just not seeing it. And in my own experience, it's blatantly obvious that there are root aspects to human language, and particularly writing systems, but not just writing systems, sound as well. The way that we use sound. Like I remember when I was a kid, at some point, probably first grade, something like this, maybe second grade, I went to my teacher and I said, we have this, I didn't say it this articulately, but I said, we have this word to see, right? And then we have the word the sea, the ocean, right? And I said, surely there's a relationship between these two words. And she said, oh, no, it's entirely arbitrary, right? And I was like, I don't think it's arbitrary. I mean, not to mention the fact that, the sea is made of salt water and our eyes have salty water in them, right? So, even as a child, I was fascinated by language in general. And I think there's a broad array of features that just don't get any airplay because in modernity, we have this sort of bizarre objectivist predisposition, right? That just makes wild, ridiculous claims for which there's no evidence, like, oh, there's no connection between these things.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people would say. It's either coincidental or, you know, it's just I can't remember if you see things in the clouds, that's it's some word.
Pareidolia.
There you
Yeah,
go. That was the word,
pareidolia.
and that kind of prevents them from seeing beyond that. And so years ago, we had some people from Google here, and he was pretty high up in Google, and they have a slide in their main office and all that stuff. And he was looking around, and he looked at me and he goes, "Will, you really think outside the box?" And I just kind of made it up at the time. I just looked at him and go, "Shh, there is no box." And he goes, "I'm going to use that in the next talk I do, because you only think there's a box because you're told there's a box, And when you step out of the box and look back, you realize there's not a box.
You know, my son the other day was saying that I'm going to paraphrase him slightly. He was saying, you know, Dad, I think this whole objective, empirical slant that the humans are fascinated by is a result of them having no idea what they are. And since we have no idea what we are, then we project that absence of knowledge onto the exterior world and just try to determine what everything is out there, right?
And then we kind of relate it to each other and the other things that we've created. But I was kind of playing with his idea. So I've spent a lot of time with the figuring out what the different alphabet letters and sounds mean. And then I kind of applied that to, first English and different languages. And then I kept expanding. I probably looked at over 300 different languages. And when I got into the Native American languages, I started finding very similar patterns repeating themselves as I saw in Africa and other places. And it just came, very obvious that this pattern exists, but until you are aware that the pattern exists, you can't really take it in. And I started looking at like how we structure our lives on things, and a lot of what we do. I'm sure you're familiar with what a cargo cult is. When in the South Pacific during World War II, people who had been relatively uncontacted, something falls out of the sky, a pilot, it could be Japanese or American pilot, and they made, they tried to make sense of it because it's some new thing in their life, and they don't understand airplanes or radios, and they incorporated that into their life without really knowing the technology. And kind of us as we'll call our, the technologically more advanced, we can look at that and kind of say, they don't understand that. And we kind of label that as a cargo cult. But then when you look back at our own culture, most of what we do is cargo cult. And very little of it is based on, objective, testable, even within the sciences. So much of the sciences, if you look at, you probably remember that when they used to say 2 eggs is over your daily cholesterol diet. And of course, there was very little science to that. And their model for what cholesterol was doing at the time was completely backwards of what, scientists would say today. But everyone would agree that this is it must be true because, it was on TV. And so that kind of gets incorporated to people's thoughts. I'm sure you've heard of when they invented radar, the British released a story that their pilots were eating carrots. That's why they could see at night. And so it was an MI6 cover story for the fact that they have a machine doing this. They didn't want the Germans to know that they could see them at night. And then the Germans had to run around and start eating massive doses of carrots, and it didn't. And even to this day, most people would believe these kind of, stories become accepted as and it starts to form this kind of cargo cult mass that you have difficulties seeing beyond. And every now and then it takes somebody to kind of step outside of what's been accepted and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't know if this is reality, or is this just a kind of a group agreed upon, mythology or and it seems like language, if you so I used to work at Monticello, or Thomas Jefferson's, home, and it was pronounced Monticello, but there were people from a town I think it was in New York, and they said, oh no, it's Monticello. And of course the correct pronunciation is Monticello, and the town is actually named after Monticello, the house. But because everyone in that town calls it Monticello, Now the correct pronunciation is Monticello because the locals call it that. And so the origins doesn't reflect what's actually being said. The new agreed upon meaning for a word could be something very arbitrary, something very different from what was originally, like words change meanings over time. And you kind of have to go with what the group accepts as the meaning of something. But as this happens, you get further away from, I'll just call it, my system that I was using is Alphaglyphics, is what I named it. It's perhaps arrogant to just come up with a name like that, but it has to be called something. And it's the structure that I think is forming language. But as languages age, they get further away from the original system. And that's what kind of really got me interested when I started looking at other languages. So like if you look at Portuguese, it's a Latin language, but it doesn't feel very much like Spanish or Italian. Spanish and Italian, kind of, you can mumble your way through some Italian if you know some Spanish. They seem close.
Mm.
But you would still see, if you read the Portuguese, it's based on the same ancestral, it has the same Latin roots, but they've so changed how they pronounce things, it's very difficult to, or at least it is for me, to pick up the words the same.
Mm.
So Italian is fairly easy, even if you don't know Italian. If you just know a little bit of Spanish, you can get your way through Italy pretty well. And these same words are in the Portuguese, but pronounced, they've changed John to Jow. They've gotten rid of a lot of letters have changed to the point where it's very difficult to recognize things. And then, my wife is, she's from Crimea, so that, whatever country that is, and largely Russian. And so having someone whose native language is a different language, and you have to explain why we do this or why we do that, you start to have to actually, a lot of times you just don't know why, well, you're an English speaker, you should know why. I don't know why we do, you just have these accepted norms of what you grew up with, but there isn't a lot of logic to it. And then as I was going through in the system, and I started discovering a bunch of things, and it was like, oh, that's why there's the silent K in English suddenly makes sense. Now, if you look it up, people will say, well, they used to say knife, and that isn't actually why they're doing it, but it represents the hand in the word, because the letter K, if you take the imprint of a hand and flatten out your fingers, your two end fingers, you get the letter K. If you draw your first finger and your last finger as a straight line, you get the K off your hand. And, that is sort of the accepted original origins of the letter K in the Phoenician alphabet to some degree.
Mm.
And it shows up in little relics in language. And I kind of, finding those weird little things like that, because if you go through your mind and make a list of the KN words that you know from English, most of them will be knocking or some sort of K, and the K with the N. I mean, I don't know how far you want to jump into this, but the letter N becomes rather hard to. The letter N is more complicated, and the letter R is more complicated in how it interacts with other letters. And so that's kind of explained if you think of the K and the N going together. And I really saw that particularly when I started looking at other languages, when I started looking at the Japanese.
Hmm.
So I believe you said you had done some martial arts,
Hmm.
and I'm not going to test you on your dojo skills, but I had and I just like quoting my sensei was Sensei Marvin, and I like saying Sensei Marvin. It just seems like a silly name for a sensei, but he made us speak Japanese, so.
Ah.
And I took um, Okinawan Shorin Ryu.
Uh-huh.
And Ryu is a school, and Shorin was the type of school. And as far as I knew, that's as far as we went. But as I was looking at language, I realized so the Japanese have no letter L, and they often put the letter R instead of L. And it is actually Shaolin Ryu, and it comes from the Shaolin Temple. And it is actually, and I never looked up the history before, but there was a woman who developed white crane uh, kung fu, I think it was, at the Shaolin, and she went to Okinawa, and that is the origins of the karate that started in Okinawa. And so now I suddenly realized that Shaorin was Shaolin, and
You
it's
know, I work in a scientific editing firm, and we edit papers primarily from Japan. It's gonna be some noise for a moment. And the neuroscientist I work with, he worked in Japan for quite some time. And apparently, at some point, the Japanese scientists and perhaps even the government, they petitioned to be able to write papers in English, but they wanted the letter L removed.
wow.
They wanted to be able to write English without L.
So you've heard of the store Lululemon?
Yeah, yeah.
So the guy invented the store, the name, um, to he's like, I want something with a lot of letter L's in it because just like we had Haagen-Dazs in America, which basically means nothing, but it sounds foreign. He thought he thought Lululemon would do real well in Japan because it sounds it's so challenging for them to say. And so that's why he came up with Lululemon because it had three L's in it, and he just thought it was funny.
So I have a couple of thoughts about some of the things you've shared before we continue too much further. The cargo cult thing is a serious problem. It's a problem. So, a lot of my work has to do with the origins of human cognition and sort of the arc over time of how the forms of cognition that we are subject to today developed and what they developed from, right? And one of the things you'll see that is it's more than evidence for the cargo cult problem. It's a blatant demonstration of the problem is that humans build machines and then they reify organisms in the image of the machines, right? So your heart is a pump, your brain, that's a computer, right? Your everything is just seen. It's almost as if people were ignorant enough to say that you're a cartoon because you're animated. I mean, you're obviously animated, right? So you must be a cartoon. There's no real relationship between machines and organisms, right? But every time we invent a new machine, we then reify some feature of the organism as if it were originally a machine. And you can see in this a peculiar feature of our predilection to sort of kill down into structure things that we have lost intimacy with, right? Because actual knowledge is about intimacy. It's not about thinking. There are precisely zero objective observers in the universe. There's no such thing as an objective observation. That's a fiction of statistics, right? We suppose, for example, that if Joe, Tim, John, Jane, and Julie all see a raccoon and they all call it a raccoon, and they all agree that this is how you say that word, well, then we suppose that's objective, right? It's a statistical convenience. There are no objective observers. It is impossible to have an objective observation. There are no such observers. All observers that we know of are subjective, right? I mean, you may have a different perspective, and I'm happy to hear about that if you do. But generally speaking, what we as humans think of as valid knowledge is merely, well, it's not merely, it's mostly the vox populi fallacy. If everybody agrees, then we'll call that objective. Empirical observations are profound, useful, and real within a very narrow scope, right? Within the scope in which empirical observations function. And by the way, this scope is engineering, it's physics, it's mathematics, right? These branches of knowledge give us the impression that perhaps everything should be empirical. So there's this weird problem with human cognition where we switch out intimacy for representations. We switch out understanding for mechanical facility and so forth. And then the other thing is just, who decides what's correct? Is that just, or would we do a poll? Right? Whoever, like 64% of people think that it should be called Monticello, right? Or whatever, right? How do we decide? So and then there's another problem, which I think you also identified, which is drift over time, right? There were some originary features of language and alphabets and so forth. And over time, those drifted and underwent kind of regenesis in various ways, in various places, at various times. And those transformations were affected by specific predilections of the people involved, specific features of how they lived, their historical ways of communicating and so forth. You know, one of the things I've become aware of, and I'll stop blathering here in just a moment, about indigenous languages and the relationship between speech and interiority in indigenous peoples, they were clearly, in the cases that I've come across anyway, particularly in the Blackfoot and the Navajo, they were clearly aware of a problem with representing identity. They knew that was a very dangerous thing to do. And so it was not merely traditional, but practically obligatory to negotiate identity rather than declare it. Right? And this is a very different way of seeing, thinking, and speaking than the ways we are familiar with, because we just say what that's Joe. I know who Joe is. Every time I see Joe, it's the same Joe. That was not the case in indigenous languages at all. Who someone was a feature of from whom they are coming. Like who do they represent in this moment? And many other features that we don't even have language about. But yes, I do have, one of the complex parts of my own strange experience was a long education about letter forms, where they came from, sound forms, what they mean together. But in our emails, you sometimes mention the muse, which I think you're referring to. Probably you caught this term from Ammon, I'm guessing.
Well, no, actually, the muse predates that quite a bit, but so I guess I saw Ammon first on Gnostic Informant. I don't know if you've ever watched that.
Oh yeah.
And unfortunately, they've seemed to disagree at some point on things for whatever reason. I won't get into their disagreements. I still find both of them educational on different matters. So
So do I.
and
The
so
disagreement, according to Gnostic, was simply that Gnostic informant does not believe that the Septuagint predated the Hebrew Bible. That's the point of dissent between them,
yeah, and
as far as I can understand it.
I have my own thoughts from my own perspective on some of this stuff, but if you want to talk about the muse, so I've had what people would call, precognitive dreams, and in my wife's culture, they're a little bit superstitious, despite having endured decades of communism. They're quite you know not specifically religious, but they believe in reading dreams. They believe in a lot of quirky superstitions. When I was first over there, I tried to, with my limited Russian, buy a dozen roses, and that was completely taboo because an even number is for dead people, and so you're supposed to have 9 roses. And the woman selling roses would not sell me 12 roses for nothing. And I kept repeating the same phrase, and I'm sure I was right with, what I was saying, but finally I just bought 9, and I didn't know that so that there's a lot of weird traditions, and they're different than ours, which is kind of interesting.
I mean, that one in particular is very important because it was made clear to me in my own so evenness and completion, to render something complete, these are problematical features of human behavior. Right? So I relate in my own way very deeply to what the inspiration underlying their refusal to sell complete, like even numbers of flowers and so forth.
Yeah,
It's
no one
fascinating.
seems to know the origins of what those things came from. And then another thing that I find fascinating about Ammon is that while I'm in the Crimea, I go to these caves that were, easily 8,000 years old, and I'm asking people, who are these people, and what are these, ancient ruins from, and what was this port city? And they keep telling me about the Skeefs, which sounds like Skef, and they kept saying Skeef, and I was like, oh, and who are they? And they said, well, they're kind of like the Greeks, but no one seemed to know what was going on. And of course, they're the Scythians. And so the port that they're right at was one of these Scythian harbors. And as I've learned more about the Scythians, I go and tell my wife, what the Scythian, and all the weird things Almond's obsession with the Scythian women
Mm-hmm.
is part of my daily life. So I live I live the experience
That's brilliant.
without the poison arrow necessarily, but
Right.
a lot of the quirks showed up. But I always wondered, like, when I started looking at some of the Russian stuff, and I would bother my wife endlessly, and she'd be like, "Oh, go away," because she doesn't want to explain her language any more than I want to explain English to her.
Hmm.
But sometimes I'll catch her on a word puzzle and be like, "Oh, yeah, I bet the word for to cut has a Z in it." And she goes, "Well, how do you know that?" I go, "Oh, does it?" She goes, "Yes." And I was like, "Well, okay." And that's what, I understand what it's coming from, and it works perfectly. And then she's sort of impressed by that. And I will get sidetracked very easily. But to stick with the muse
Hmm.
uh, specifically, so she believes in some of these things, but she's also, she went through medical school, so she really is Medea in a way. But
Oh, by the way, I mean, Ammon's ex-wife was an anesthesiologist and tried to poison their 2 children.
yeah, I actually heard that from some podcast, and I felt weirdly disgusted by the Wes guy that posted that stuff, because I was like, no matter how much you dislike someone, you really shouldn't drag them through the internet mud like that. But
We agree about that, but that comes from so that comes from, I don't think this is something Ammon would hide. It comes from I can't recall the word for when a lawyer takes
Yeah, the deposition.
it comes from the deposition, right? He mentions it in the deposition. And I'm sure this is a matter of some, pain for him. All I'm trying to say is I'm certainly not trying to drag anyone into the mud or defame anyone, but
No, it was just
Armin
it
clearly has a kind of a mythic historical relationship situation that deeply resembles features of Medea, it
yeah, no,
seems to me.
yeah, I just having been through a deposition on my myself, it's only those who've been through them understand how how they can be.
No,
And
no, I think what they did in that was egregiously, if not vicious, close.
well,
Uh,
I just saw with the guy who put it up, and I don't watch his stuff because he's in a different a different cult than I am, and but just understanding that this uh, what Wes Huffman, I think was his name, who
hmm,
posted it, that I saw it, and I realized that he hasn't suffered through one of those experiences, because if you had, you would have empathy for anyone that had,
yeah,
you wouldn't bring it up. And so he doesn't understand what that was.
no.
And I know
Well, I
that
mean,
when,
if somebody, let's be clear, if it's someone's initial goal to defame another human being, well, already, where's the basis for trust in that? Like, what's up with this person? I merely brought it up because I think there's a mythic background to Hillman's perspectives and orientations and so forth that's quite profound and human and alive. And I find Hillman fascinating and very rare kind of human being.
well, he looks at things in a very unique way. And even if you disagree with any individual thing he says, his perspective is, if you have someone way over there looking at something, they may see things, you might see the cup as a square, somebody else might see it as a circle, but it's really a, three-dimensional object, and another perspective might be just what some people could use.
Yeah,
But
Hillman is a prodigy, and he is in the Greek, in my view anyway, he's what could be understood as manisthai, right? He speaks from the spirit of enthusiasm. It's very uncommon to find this. You find people emulating it all the time in Christianity. Hillman's not emulating it, right? He's not playing a game that I can see anyway. So he's a very rare kind of human being. And I find his work fascinating. I don't have to agree. I don't have to judge what he says to find his work valuable and profound. Right? It's not necessary. Those two things don't have to go together for me. Um, but I want to return to this concept of the muse and its
so,
meaning for
yeah.
you.
So because my wife takes the dream analysis somewhat serious, in a kind of a hobbyist, some people believe in this stuff, some people don't. I am actually much more, she's very skeptical about a lot of stuff, but in terms of that stuff, even things that happened to me, I would be skeptical, because if you, it's very easy to fool yourself that oh, I saw this in a dream. So what I would do, and this is a pattern that I'll just give you one story, because I think it's undisputable that it's
Okay.
something weird, and so it's certainly not the first go around for us, but often on the first night of a vacation, and I've heard from other people that said that on the first, when you're in a different environment, sometimes your brain is a little more aware, or you're open to new things, or your brain is working. If you're in a routine, maybe you're boring, you don't have anything interesting going on. And so if I have an interesting dream the first night of a vacation, I'll and it's always at a certain time usually, but of course if you're on vacation sometimes you're a little bit jet lagged, or you've been traveling. So we went to San Diego, over on your coast, and this was a few years back, and I had this dream, and I told her, and it's a pretty weird dream, and I usually argue with whoever's telling me things in the dream, as I am the skeptic. And the first part of the dream was there was a house, and I was building the house for this person, and they had an entirely glass foundation. And I just told them, you can't have a house with a glass foundation. That's absolutely ridiculous. How do we bet? And so I'm arguing with this, but then the dream goes on, and I go to this park, and there's this green bench, and there's these little black dogs, and there's multiple ones, and they have no legs. And I pick one up, and it's kind of grumpy with me, and I set it back down, and I said, hey, those legless dogs are kind of mean. And so I told her that in the morning, and of course, there's no way to make much sense of all that because it doesn't really make sense. And we go for a walk, and we're staying just north of, or just south of La Jolla on the beach there. And we walk along the beach, and she sees a dog that's like a corgi, and she said, well, that dog has almost no legs. And so my wife is kind of, laughing at me about the dream, but I said, well, that's it was a whitish dog, and it still had legs. It just didn't fit right. And so we walk up the cliffs and decide to come back along the, there's these big fancy houses up on the cliffs. And, La Jolla is pretty schmancy. And we were looking at these, whatever, I think $10 million wouldn't even get you a garage up there. But and we come to this house, and it has a 3-foot moat around it of concrete wall, and the entire foundation is glass, all of it below grade. It is the most odd thing. I've never seen it. There's actually a second house we found on the same walk, that clearly by the same architect. And what they did was they just gapped the foundation wall 3 feet out and made a 10-foot high concrete wall straight down, and the entire foundation was glass panels looking out at this concrete wall. And as a builder, I would say that can't happen, but when I see it, I go, oh, that's, and my wife's like blown away because that's exactly what I told her. And because it's not something that I could fool myself that I thought of it later. So she's the kind of the objective observer.
Yeah, I mean, the chance there's there's so many problems with how humans think. I find it interesting that you classify yourself as a skeptic. It's very complicated, this matter, because in my own research into human cognition and so forth, often humans will make comments about what someone believes or doesn't believe. And in my own experience and in my own sort of quest for understanding and insight, belief is most commonly an obstacle. It's not a functional thing. It's a thing we do to protect ourselves, mostly from stuff that we don't understand. We're like, oh, I believe that, or I don't believe that. And the things that we make decisions about this with, in other words, the architecture of the cognition that we use to determine whether we believe something or not, is mostly garbage in almost every case. We just don't look at it, right? We don't look at it. It's similar to our houses, right? We live in boxes that evicts ambiguity. Having the ambiguity evicted lowers the vigilance floor, right? The less ambiguity we have, the less unpredictability we have, the less we have to pay attention. And humans are famous for doing stuff that evicts ambiguity to lower the vigilance floor, right? In my room, nothing changes. There's nothing moving in here. There's not one living thing in here other than I've got a plan, right? Nothing moves, nothing changes. If something does change, I can immediately tell, like, wait, that's out of place. We live in boxes, and that's weird. And most of the ways we are trained to think are the result of living in those boxes. It's interesting what you said about if one travels, excuse me, then the mind may open up. And part of the reason the mind may open is because we are not in a familiar box, right? Even if we're still in a box, like we're in a hotel or wherever we are, it's an unfamiliar box. And so we don't actually know what to expect. I remember watching, so in terms of like precognitive dreams, that's just a straight up real thing. I mean, it's as real as the sun rising in the sky. People don't believe in it. I don't care what they believe. I don't care at all, right?
Yeah.
It's like
So
saying I don't believe in cars or something, right? It's just like, go ahead, don't believe. I don't care. Um, it may be that dreams are, so dreams are really complex. They don't just serve a single purpose, but it's precognition is built into the dreaming um, mode of awareness. And humans think things like, it's impossible to know the future. You can't do that. Go ahead and think that. Be my guest, right? You can think fish are dry, the desert is wet. Think whatever you like, right? I don't care. A lot of the time, skepticism just protects us. It's a sort of defense mechanism from things that we would find would threaten our ontology, right? Our world picture, our picture of what is real, what isn't real, and so forth. And on the one hand, there certainly are delusions, right? Humans have delusions.
right.
That's a fact, okay? However, what they don't do the accounting for is how much of the eviction of what is real and accessible to humans is delusional. Because although there are delusions over here and those can be dangerous, this delusion over here of evicting things you don't understand is catastrophically more common and monumental than this one over here, right? So people are like, I don't want to think things that could be crazy. On the other hand, most of your thinking is crazily non-creative, uninspired. Not you, but our
Yeah,
common
no.
thought is like living in the tip of one's pinky of your body or something. It's just ridiculous. And this little thing is going like, well, that's delusional. Go ahead, believe the monster, right? It wants to, it's terrified that it'll be dethroned by something resembling living insight. And when I think of the muse, although I don't yet know exactly what you mean by that, for me, I know there are beings. I know the same way I know that water is wet in my, like if I drink some. There are beings they are non-physical beings and they are pure insight. They don't have judgments. They don't have like delusions. They are pure insight. And I'm pretty sure our minds are their children. But we don't have that experience most of the time because we got the 12 roses problem. The structure, dead structure, overwhelms the aspect that can sense. And yet, light leaks in, and we become curious about things like alphabets.
Well, I've become curious about lots of things, and as I guess as an innkeeper, I become more and more curious. But the second half of that story was that I saw legless dogs, and that seems like a rare thing. So I don't know where in the East Coast or West Coast you are, but if you go on the other side of La Jolla, we went to some cave and we came out, and there's this horrible racket of barking. And we went down to the beach, and there was a sleeping sea lion, and everyone was kind of taking pictures with it. And the water was up to where you couldn't get back out the stairs without getting wet. We were just in our regular street shoes, so we weren't prepared to get wet. But there were a couple other tourists there, and so this sea lion was there, just sleeping in the sun and not moving. and this other sea lion comes out of the water, screams at it, and then they kind of do a little battle, and the other sea lion pushes that sea lion out. And so now this sea lion that has been pushed out looks at us, and there was like maybe 8 or so people in this little group on the beach. We're kind of just trapped there, and chases us in kind of slow motion. You know, I have real black bears here, so it's not really, they're very similar, but and I'm looking at this thing as it's chasing us at 2.5 miles an hour going across the beach, and my wife, we both go, that's a legless dog. It's a
I was
legless.
hoping you were going to get to that. It's also black, right?
Yeah, I know it was exactly but my brain in the dream is trying to compartmentalize information that I don't necessarily have an image for.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, see, I find this very peculiar about humans. They will have experiences that are blatantly non-ordinary, right? Because it's supposed to be, quote unquote, it's supposed to be impossible to directly, correctly sense the future. Yet this clearly occurred to you. And at the same time, it doesn't appear to have muchly affected your skepticism or your ontology. You saw into time, for sure, not
Well,
maybe.
I saw into time in a short span, which is actually easier than the dreams that you have. If you had a dream that happened 7 years later, even if you remember that dream, your ability to say aha.
Correlate it, yeah.
But if it happens within 24 hours or 12 hours even of your dream, all of it unfolds. Two seemingly impossible scenarios unfold within one day. And
Yeah,
you've already,
seemingly impossible to the aspect of consciousness that
in a
is.
material world, that's impossible.
No, it's not impossible. It's just humans like to say that.
Yeah, but
That's the
within
only
within
thing. It has nothing to do with possibility or impossibility. Right? Humans just say things. They just make shit up and they go like, well, that's how the world is.
within the cargo cult, I guess it doesn't
Yeah,
happen.
exactly. Who cares? Like, I mean, I do care because it's blinding and it's cruel. We should not teach our children absurd things about the predictability or normativity of the world or being human. That's vicious, in my view. It's crippling. It's wrong. I remember seeing, so certainly I've had, precognitive dreams. I've also had intuitions about the future. I mean, I have other experiences that are much deeper than those that I'll not bother you with. But there's a gentleman, I can't recall his name at the moment, or necessarily where I saw him. It might have been on Danny Jones. He's been researching precognitive dreams for many, many years and has gathered a lot of evidence in favor not just of the fact that precognitive dreams exist. He's actually declaring that all dreams are precognitive. The reason that we don't realize they're precognitive is because their coding doesn't always, sometimes it's a bit too obscure for us to make the links, right? But your dream seems blatantly obvious. And
Yeah, and
go ahead.
that's just one dream.
Right.
And I use that one because it had no effect on me personally,
Uh-huh.
in that nothing happened. There's other dreams that were, I saw my wife. I told my wife what our children would look like before they were born, including their hair color and certain events that were so repeated that it's like, okay, yes, that's it. Okay. And it's almost boring when it happens, but it's, we've had these discussions, we've been married for, I should know, 21 years now. And so we've gone through a lot of this stuff from being, I understand what other people would say, because I've had these discussions with people who, if you don't see these things, it's very hard to convince somebody that it happens. And once you do,
It depends on who you talk to, William. Depends on who you talk to. It's hard to convince people who live in boxes that there are circles.
yeah.
Sure. But
And so you have to understand their point of view too, that if they don't see it, or they can't see it for whatever reason.
I mean, they can't see the Kremlin, but they believe it exists, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things they have never seen that they believe, quote unquote, exists. Why should they be so skeptical about these specific things? Obviously, there's something threatening here, or, right, there's a problem of some kind. But I just find it interesting that you describe yourself as a skeptic, even though you've clearly had experiences that are non-ordinary, that are effectively irrefutable. I mean, the dream you described, there's no chance, there's no way I can possibly understand that as a mere coincidence, right? It's too blatantly, obviously direct, seems to me.
And that's why I like that story, because it's kind of silly
Yeah, it
and
is,
non,
but it's great. I love the legless dog part. That's
the
awesome.
legless dogs is not anything I would come up with. But then I've noticed weird patterns like that in language also, where if you think about it longer, you'll find out that, even in like Akkadian, their word for a pigeon, and I can't remember what it was, but it literally translated out as poop in the street.
Right.
And it's just like, people will make up weird names, and if you just understood that the word was poop in the street, you might not. Oh, and then you say it's a pigeon. Oh, okay. You only get it after a lot of what you. I don't know. It's like a puzzle that you don't see. When once you see it, you get it. But if you don't see it, you don't see it. It's even within
So
language.
the aspect of human, okay, so first of all, unfortunately, at least in English, we rarely make up words. You apologized for having made up a word a little earlier in the conversation, if I recall. You said something like, it's arrogant of me to have made up this word alphaglyphics. I don't know why you thought that was arrogant, particularly, but I want to mention something that I think is very important. There's a certain phase in childhood in which we are much more likely to invent words, and particularly to invent private lexicals with our close companions. We did this as a child in my peer groups, probably most commonly between the ages of 6 and perhaps 11. Um, because we speak English, and English is a relatively non-neologizing, non-word making language, most of us don't have an experience of neologizing. Hillman talks about neologizing in Greek and is deeply aware that it's important for you to be able to make words yourself. Um, because of my experience as a writer and someone fascinated by linguistics, I do neologize somewhat regularly, not in common conversation, only if I'm trying to come up with a way to communicate about a topic that we're missing a word for. But there are languages that are natively neologizing. I think German is one of them, right? It's a language of particles that you can sort of just, they're a
Yeah,
bit
you
like
get.
Legos, right? If I understand correctly.
Yeah, it keeps getting longer. You get those super long.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah. So that's a naturally neologizing language. But I don't think there was anything arrogant about your inventing of the phrase alphaglyphics. And I think you're fundamentally onto something. But there's a couple more things I want to mention before I stop frothing at the mouth here. So one of them is that the aspects of human consciousness or awareness that are involved in the creation of language, they are fundamentally non-ordinary. They're not like things you can think. They're not like thinking. They have deep, poetic, and what is the right word? Prosaic, the prosody. They have deep senses of prosody, poetics, um, similar sounds, rhyme, all these things, much like the dreaming mind, right? They're not usually, I think it might even be impossible for them to be simply pragmatic. right? Even though we can find examples that look relatively pragmatic in word structure, phoneme use, and so forth. So yeah, there's like this, there's like a hidden intelligence here, and if we want contact with that intelligence, I guess the Greeks would probably have referred to it as the logos. Um, there's an intelligence from which the possibility of things like letters and phonemes and words arises. The humans don't believe in that. They don't believe in that. There's no thing like that. Humans just make up words. Yeah, of course. Right? They're just down there making shit up. Yeah. No, there's no way of doing that. In fact, it would be impossible to make anything if the sun wasn't there. The humans don't believe there's an origin for things. Good for them, right? The thing they're not believing with has an origin right there in the sky. No sun, no thing you're believing things with, right? So this idea that like origin isn't real or doesn't matter, or we can't contact it, or it's just, made up shit is insane. Anyway, so yeah, these features, there's an intelligence, an array of intelligences involved in the history and the origination of languages, writing, and so forth. And it's uniquely instanced in every people and time, but that fingerprint is always recognizable. And I think this is what you're onto. You sense that fingerprint.
That's when you started talking about that. I don't know if Ammon sees it that way. I think that he sometimes criticizes the Hebrew. I don't know necessarily to be defensive of the Hebrew, but there's some interesting things that happens in the Hebrew.
I just want to say something brief about that, and then I'll ask you to continue. So Ammon's correct to a degree when he says, there were only 8,000 Hebrew words. The Greeks had 300,000 words. Who was doing the right? Where's the medicine? No, there's nothing. There's nothing there, right? He'll say. And he's right about that, but he's overlooking something, which is that at a certain point in history, things flip over, right? And then the Hebrew becomes astonishingly sophisticated. So both things are true. It's not, no, it's only the Greek, right? The Greek. That's true over an epoch, but there's an overlapping epoch where the Hebrew rises into incredible sophistication. So yeah, please go on.
And I'm certainly not a Hebrew expert. Like I say, I started in English and then did some other different languages that I was looking at.
I'm a
But
bit of a Hebrew expert.
but when I started looking at the Hebrew, at first when I tried to learn a little bit of Hebrew, it's a little daunting it's a little challenging at first.
Hmm.
But then I went to some other languages, and then I kept I came back to the Hebrew after looking at the Akkadian, and to me, the Akkadian, and I didn't look at it for a long, long time because it just seemed, it's a challenging one, and I didn't find any good translations until for a while. But anyway, I started looking at it, and I'm like, oh, I keep understanding what the word is before I can read this stuff. Just basically using the pattern that I already know from looking at language. This language makes sense. So I would say about 25% of the words in Akkadian make sense to me in what they mean versus what the letters I think they should mean, which may not mean much to other people. But when you look at the Hebrew and I was like, okay, I think that they created the Hebrew from Akkadian and Aramaic with a filter. And the filter being the words had to make sense to the letters that are contained in them. And if you said, okay, you have, 100,000 words in English, or I think it's 175,000 words in English. But then you said, okay, well, use your Alphaglyphics filter to just get words that fit with what you think would be, okay, here's a really good word because it means these, and a very simple example would be what I think I emailed to you was the idea of a fractal word. And I don't know if you're familiar with fractals, but the small part is the same as the big part. And so, like, if you look in the Hebrew, the word bet is house, and the word B, or the letter B, is house. And so you already have house within there. The rest of the word's kind of irrelevant. The R is the head, the symbol for the head, and Rosh, whichever. And these are also all Akkadian words. But some Akkadian words don't seem to make any sense, and probably people just on the street made them up, and it meant, whatever it needed to mean at the time, and it didn't have a reason. It wasn't following rules, which is what happens when everyone just uses them. But if you're creating and I'm not sure when Hebrew, people will argue when the oldest Hebrew is around. I think most of it came after the Babylonian exile or whatever, which was around, I guess, 600 BC, I'll say. And so we don't really have any writing before that. So we don't have a sense that there's this organic language growing from nothing. But then they were going to create a language, and they wanted the language to look like the original source code, whatever that might be. And I think if they went through the older versions, because Aramaic is not as, it doesn't fit the pattern that I like as well as the Akkadian does. So it's evolving away from the pattern. I think somebody back then recognized this same pattern, used that to find words that would fit that pattern, and created a language and a Bible trying to make it fit into these words, that the letters within the words actually mean what the word is. And it happens almost all the time in Hebrew, so much so that it seems intentional.
It might not. Okay, that I get it. I get what you're saying. It seems like it was done on purpose. However, I think we should at least entertain the possibility that it was very unlikely to do it any other way. Right? To do it in another way would mean that abstraction would have to prevail over intuition. Right? Like the meaning of, so that letters have meaning is for most English speakers a weird idea. For people who speak Hebrew or Arabic, or there must be many other languages in which the letters have meaning. But letters in English have meanings. In fact, they're very similar to the meanings that we might get from Greek or Hebrew. I'm sure you're aware. I mean, I know that you're aware from reading, some of your work, that the shapes of the letters even have meanings. What are your thoughts?
That's yeah.
So what I heard you saying is that at some point in history, when, for example, the Bible was being written in Hebrew, there was an attempt, even, I think attempt's the wrong word. It was natural for them to forge, yeah, see, there's a problem here, and the problem is that
it's territory that I don't fully claim to understand, but I just see that the pattern there is, too strong to be coincidental.
Yeah, it's not arbitrary, not by a long shot. The thing I was thinking is, it was not, on the one hand, we could say it's natural for them to form words in which the meanings of the letters contribute their spirit to the word itself. But the problem with that is that the words existed before the alphabets, right? There was speaking Hebrew long before there was writing Hebrew. And the indigenous languages had no writing whatsoever. Many of them, right? There was no alphabet. They didn't spell things. They just spoke them. There was no spelling for, ixocapi no spelling for this until later when the Blackfoot people were colonized and they, acquired the English alphabet. I mean, there's a huge mystery here, and it goes back to something like, see, I'm going to just be, I won't blather on, but I'll say something very brief and simple. I would be absolutely shocked if if I could travel back 10,000 years ago and I found humans without non-ordinary intelligences linked to their minds moment to moment, the way we live. I don't think there were any humans like that. We don't know what it is to be human because we do not experience it's similar to flowers that live on a world without bees. Like, we were born to relate with bees, but we don't know they exist. We don't believe in bees, right? We don't think there's things that, put the pollen between the minds, right? We just don't think there are such things, which is really like fish not having never encountered water or something. It's so fundamental to what it is to be human, in my view, that it's very shocking to be without it. And so it seems clear to me that the languages were attempts to do something similar to what those experiences of transmission caused in our awareness. And when that disappeared, then we had to make figures, right? Shapes in
Right.
light. I mean, the other weird thing about letters is just think about this really bizarre feature of them. They shape light to cross time and space into other minds, right? This is their function, right? They shape light to cross time and space into another mind. That's a very weird thing to try to do.
I think the bee thing is actually a very good analogy, and it took a long time for me to come around to the so there's multiple like when I started seeing things in the Japanese, I thought that was nonsense because they don't have letters, they have kanjis. And as far as I'm told, oh, those are language isolates. They didn't have contact with and yet there's words in there, and I have just there's words, and I don't have all this list in front of me, but you can go through word by word and say, well, that looks an awful lot like the word for in Hebrew, or the word for you can see these parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, that's just can't be right. And then I started when I showed you that one example where I went through the word Nakasendo, because it's this trail, and I would like to go there one day. And I just like, well, someone said what it meant, and they said it meant trail through the mountains or something like that. And there's no word for mountain, and there's no real word for and it's like, wait a minute, that's probably not what it does mean. But then I started breaking it up, and I don't know what a Japanese person would even say it means, because a lot of times these translations don't, you'll say it means this or that, but it doesn't really encompass either of those words sometimes. And so sometimes the translation is, you hear lost in translation. And I started looking at the word shima in Japanese. Now, shima shows up all over the place, but in Japanese, if you look it up, it'll say it means island, and they can also paraphrase, change the sh to a j. That's where Iwo Jima means island. Except there's a bunch of places called Shima, and they're not islands. And so there's a bunch of towns called Shima, but it's not an island. And when I look at it through my analysis, the sh in a kind of verb sense, the sh is to divide. Do you see that? And so, and the ma, you can speak any language you want, except, we've reversed the M to W in our silly northern language, but ma is water in Arabic, and all throughout Africa,
Mhm.
Amanzi and is, in the Zulu language. You can go to the Cherokee and ask them what water is, and they'll go, ama. Okay. And it also means milk. It basically just means all the liquids. And we get it in marine and other things in English. It's all over English.
Mhm.
We don't necessarily say we're completely aware of it, but you see an M, it's got to be something. It could be blood. It's a lot of times blood, uh, but it's a liquid
Mhm.
in those categories. And so, if you say that Ireland is divided by water, it's land divided by water. If you go to any of these towns, they're also divided by a river.
Yeah, 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 yeah. This is great. Yeah.
And so they're saying the same thing,
Yep.
but it doesn't mean. Sometimes it means island. What we would say in English is island,
Uh-huh.
but it really just means divided by water. And it could just be that a big river goes through. Most towns actually have a big river in them, so there's all these shimas that are, like Hiroshima and other shimas that they're not
Sure.
islands. They're divided
Yeah.
by a river.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Yeah,
now
I
it's
mean, nightmare basically means like bad water, right? That mare is water,
yeah.
right?
And the mare and horse is actually because they were milking them. A
Oh,
mare,
really?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where
Or
you get
yeah, it
mom.
means like dark milk or something, right? Like black milk or something. But
No,
no,
it doesn't have
these
it,
things
it
are
doesn't have to be milk. It's just a liquid. But
yeah.
when you call a female horse a mare, the mare is because they would milk the horses in original times. That was
But
a
it's like ma re, right? It's like that water, but with re. And that re, I mean, I would argue, and this is a very simplistic, um, I'm using a very simplistic toy here, but that ma is origin, and the re is radiates energy, right? Just literally r radiate, e new things come out, right? Children, ma re, right? So these letters, it's not that they have, in the way that I think, in my view anyway, in my current view, it's not that they have explicit, always the same thing meanings. Rather, it is that principles are obviously associated with the letters. It's not an accident that radio, radar, radius, these things, they're about transmission and reception, right? It's there's no way that that's just arbitrarily accident. Oh, that's just, how it turned out. No one tried. It's probably true that no one tried to make that happen. Go ahead.
well, in your radio term, I've never thought about this word before, but we have the letter D, which, as you know from your, I don't know if you took in your karate, the dojo, do is the way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have the way of radiating in your radio,
Mm-hmm.
you've
I mean,
you've
it's much worse. It's like R, radiate, A, first principle, D, to distribute, I, selves, O, the universe, over all spaces, right? It's blatantly obvious. Like, there's things in our language that we are not trained to look for. Therefore, we are likely to dismiss them at first glance, even if someone presents them to us. And I was just, again, I'm not even using complex analysis here. I'm making something that's very toy-like that I could give to children, right? And they would be
right.
like, "Oh, right." I'm not trying to prove my work or give you the calculus of the letters, right? I'm just showing that there's something fundamental in the sounds and the shapes of the letters, both, that they are not necessarily universal in the sense that they are explicitly instanced in all languages, but as you say, the fingerprint is there. Or as you know,
Right.
this is my analogy, right? You can sense the fingerprint, and that fingerprint leads to something.
And it's repeatable. And I was sure that, you know, when I first looked at a few languages, I started with, I think, Algonquin, and started going through that. And one of the issues with the Native American languages is that they have not been written down for a very long time, or I mean, till very recently. So they were,
Actually, one thing about it that's trippy is they were not collapsed into writing.
so most of them became written down in like 1820s, and which was actually long after contact with, you know, whatever, you
Colonization.
know,
Yeah.
the whited man, and you know, the I don't know if I mentioned that in one of the things, but I started looking at English because I realized I didn't understand English very well, because I don't know how much um, words really mean what they mean, and I realized that I am using what consensual, you know, people are using for these words. But when I you know, when I studied and worked for Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, and I worked at Poplar Forest later, which was his summer home that he built while he was president. Uh, you know, I was reading his letters that he was writing to the original carpenter to rebuild the building, and you have to realize that Thomas Jefferson's understanding of things is different than ours. He's using words that are fairly similar. It's not that far away, but his concepts of things are slightly different than our concepts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly
Probably.
enough, back to the, you know, you said that we have different analogies using technology. Well, of course, in their time period, God was the watchmaker, because the watch was kind of the height of technology. That was when they first figured out, you know, longitude and stuff like that. You got Cook sailing around the world with this idea, this magical chronometer is now going to, you know. So God was a watchmaker, and now you have Elon Musk saying, you know, God is a, you know, makes simulator games.
I prefer the old one.
So, but we're always analogizing it to some piece
Yeah,
of technology,
right.
which may not be the best. Yeah, it's
No,
maybe
no,
it's,
wait. Let me just interrupt that. Not only is it not the best, it's blatantly, you might as well just stick a knife in your brain. If you want analogies, what you go to is nature,
yeah.
not machines, right? The earth wasn't like swarming with machines when organisms arose. We didn't find any here, right? We had to assemble those from parts. So if you want analogies that are intelligent and insightful, you go to nature. If you want to get dumber, you just substitute machines for natural processes. That's my little lecture. I'm sorry, but please continue.
Well, I, if you don't mind getting completely sidetracked,
No, let's go.
um, one of the earlier things in my little, you know, before I got into language, did you get my last email? I sent you some images.
I did.
And so I made this door that was Gobekli Tepe, Pillar 43, and kind of spent way too much time with that, carving it, and got to understand it. And the only way to understand something is to really dig into it. And if you can't draw it, you don't understand it.
Yes. You
And
have to
so I
do
spent,
it with your hands.
and I
You have
started
to,
realizing that everything that they did was intentional, because when I carve something and anybody else carves something, you're kind of marking, you're not going to make an error because you've already scratched out what you're going to do with a chalk or, you know, charcoal or whatever they were using at the time. And then you're carving in stone, which takes a long time. I'm a wood guy, so I do my wood, you know, versions of it, but I still spent a long time looking at the vulture. It's and the things above it really bothered me, and it took me a long time to really make sense of what they were. But I was like, they're intentional, and so it was sort of the start of what got me into the letter K, because there's these kind of double V looking things, and that some of them are upside down and some of them are right side up, and they just kind of make a kind of, I think a lot of people just see it as some sort of pattern that's of no particular, it's just some sort of basket weave pattern, but
Yeah,
it's,
I don't care about those people. Let's talk about what actually matters. Keep going. I'm looking at the images right now.
so because I spent a long time carving it, I would occasionally go back and think about it, and I don't think I had the answer, but at some point I feel like the answer was like, "Hey, dummy, this is math," and then it became blatantly obvious, and it's just one of those things that it's a hand, and so a hand up is 5, and a hand down is 5, and I think it's been shortened to the, if you look at the Etruscan or the Roman V is 5 in the Roman numerals, and so this is an earlier version of that, showing hands up and hands down, each being a unit of 5, and I knew right away, and I went down and counted it because I was fairly accurate on my door, and I looked at some other images as well. The number is 72, which is this number of the universe, because that ends up being the zodiacal precession of the equinox moves every 72 years. It moves one degree, which ends up being 1 day. A lot of times people explain this more complicated than it needs to be, but a degree is a day. It's been changed to 360 because it's easier math. But if you think of this is the clockwork, they were understanding the clockwork of the universe. And of course, we would give credit to some late Greek person for finally figuring out that the stars shift in a certain rate based on this precession of the equinox.
I mean, this knowledge is
So I'm
vastly,
sure.
vastly older
Yeah.
than we suspect. De Santillana and von Decken wrote this book, Hamlet's Mill, that talks about this. It's one of the most amazing books I've ever seen. It's truly astonishing. Hang on just a second here. Just want to adjust my cam a little bit. So I'm looking at the image. Where in it is the hand that you speak of? Just help me see.
So just above the bird's head is a line of, I'll call it numbers, but it's a line of up V's and down V's.
Oh yes.
And when you suddenly realize that, so if you look at how the Etruscans would sometimes make their V's upside down, so you would have an up facing V and a down facing V, and of course if you put the two V's together, you get an X, which would be 10.
I see.
And this is an earlier format of writing, and then you get 2 extra digits at the end, which I don't think are accidental. I think they're intentional. A lot of people would just say, well, they ran out of room, but I don't see that as being an issue when you're spending that much time carving something. You would just adjust it before you started cutting. But
yeah, the idea that they were just goofing around with visually pleasing patterns is bullshit. This is not what was going on, right? In my view.
So I think they were, aware of a lot of stuff, and I think that would go along with, other people's assumptions, and then I don't know why we want everyone to be less intelligent and the history of the Earth to be so much shorter. I don't know if that makes it easier to understand, or does that make us better, or?
Well, I mean, it's complicated. So we suppose the part of the problem is the appearance of mastery over the forces of nature that our machines give us. I mean, even the word us is highly suspect because we're not an us in any meaningful way. I mean, we're mostly just a bunch of individuals unless a corporation captures a bunch of us and puts us to work for them. um, in which case we're kind of like slaves. But
Yeah.
if you look at ancient architecture, Hillman likes to denigrate Egypt and stuff. He likes to yell at the pyramids and whatever, which is fine. I'm not tripping. But I've been studying the work of Schwaller de Lubitz and some of the people who condense that work for more easy, for easier digestion, so to speak. And it's wildly obvious that the Egyptians were aware of principles of harmony in nature. And by harmony, I don't mean things that go together. I mean complex mathematical formula, the harmonics, the harmonic frequencies that are involved in the generation of music and also in the generation of language. They were blatantly, obviously aware of these things. And this awareness has been universally denied by Egyptologists. I mean, it's demonstrably undeniable, and the Egyptologists are still going like, yeah, that's just bullshit. We don't. Did anyone ever look at did you guys look? No, we don't need to look. It's like the problem with Galileo showing that the planets are orbiting the sun. He's like, just look through the telescope. We don't need to see what's in there. You're just making stuff up. And God moves the planets around, I think one of the medical professionals who first realized that the heart was moving blood through the body, when he told people, it's pumping blood, there were these vast screeds against it. No, the heart can't be a pump. No one has ever heard a beating heart inside a human body, blah, on and on and on. They just didn't even look, right? The trenchancy of their assumption of superior knowledge was so severe that it was effectively unshakable. You had to just wait till those people died, right? To get new knowledge, you just had to wait till they died, because it's not going to look.
It seems to be in every field, and I guess that goes back to the cargo cult.
By the way, this is part of what pisses off Hillman, right?
Yeah.
Like the fictions of the Academy are ridiculous and absurd, and they're so entrenched that they'll just destroy you if you try to say anything else, I think it's really brilliant that you did that carving, because your capacity to understand what's going on there, when you do something with your hands, if you recreate something others have created, it's a completely different possibility space for understanding than it is if you try to think about it. It's like, go ahead, think about kissing a girl. Be my guest. Think away. You think about it for the rest of your life. You will never understand what it's like. Right. There's no chance of you. Think about the flavor of a meal. Go ahead. But yet this is what moderns are trained to do. They seem to suspect that they can think about things and understand them. It's not true. You have to do things to understand things, right?
And that's what I had done when I worked at different museums and stuff like that. That I was a hands-on person. So I built the skylight on Poplar Forest, and Thomas Jefferson designed it, and he designed it while he was president, and he made copies of these letters, and people can read about it, but it's like, I understand what he was. There's a certain hands-on thing where how things are done, because it's a big part of the debate in the archaeological, or people who do work at museums. There's the book people versus the people who say, well, I know how they did that because I'm a human, and I only, you can only do these in certain ways, and this is a tree, and they had trees, like, there's only so many ways you can cut wood, and if you work with different things, you're gonna come up with the same solution over time, because you're working with the same wood and the same problems. You're gonna you have to face you have to have boots on the ground and actually do things. It's a little disappointing, the pyramid stuff, because very few of those people are physical people.
Yeah.
I hand split shingles at Colonial Williamsburg. I know how they're done. I hand split siding. I could tell you how you know, how trees work, because I've worked with them in ways that you know, a lot of people used to work with but don't today, and I kind of understand it, and in a different way than someone else might theorize about it. There's a certain, it's like, no, you do it. You learn how, the wood will tell you what it needs to do.
Mm-hmm.
And
And how
people,
will it tell you? It will tell you through your hand,
by
right?
yeah, and if you
It
do
will
it
tell
wrong,
you, yeah. It won't
it
tell
won't
you in
work.
your brain. It's not something, the wood is not going to think to you. It will tell you by the intimacy of touching it, yeah, shaping it,
Yeah, and
relating with it, physically relating with it. This is the thing, intimacy. I mean, also like the human hand, this is the whole problem on this entire planet. Like there's nothing as dangerous as that, and there's nothing as liberating as this. Unfortunately, we tend to sort of collapse down into the danger part as humans. But yeah, this is the most important thing going on around here for a good, 50, 60,000 years minimum, probably much longer. Um, in terms of its impact on life on this world, right? There's nothing more impactful than this in nature. Nothing. Not one thing. It changes everything. It makes dead structure possible. I wonder if you might be willing to just take like a 5-minute break and then return.
okay,
How do you feel about that? Would that be all
that's,
right?
yeah,
Great. See you in 5. I'm just going to leave
okay.
the recording on. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
It's such a pleasure to just be having this conversation. It's super fun.
Well,
And I mean,
I'm very glad to have the conversation with you. It's been very interesting, and I hope. Um, I don't know. I have so many more things that I could tell you about, but I don't want to necessarily steer you in ways. And if you have different things that you want to talk about, or
no, I mean we're just kind of getting to know each other, and it's so wonderful because we've had these exchanges in text through email and such, but to actually meet and speak together and talk about the things that we're passionate about and the puzzles and the quests that we've been on is super important. And I have a bunch of questions for you that I haven't asked yet. This is the same problem I had with the interview with Ammon. I mean, I was hoping that we'd have a number of conversations, so I didn't actually get to the meat with him. Um, but I don't know if I'll be able to have another conversation with him. But I want to show you something very basic here for a moment and talk about a couple of things about what ancient peoples were doing when they made what we call symbols, which is not what they were making. So I was introduced through being exposed to Ammon. It led to a variety of introductions to other people, and I'm going to be talking with Normandy Ellis next week, which I'm super excited about. She studied hieroglyphs her entire, for most of her adult life, and is an absolute prodigy. But there are many women whose knowledge it's just so different from men. They're not egotistical. They're just alive with wonder. So I was listening to an interview between Joanna Kuyawa, Dr. Kuyawa, and this guy Chance Gardner, who made an incredible series about Egypt that's very difficult to get a hold of. And he introduced me to this book, The Serpent in the Sky by Anthony West. This is the book I was talking about that condenses the work of Schwaller de Lubitz, who wrote this 1,000-page document called The Temple of Man that I'll acquire shortly. But I just want to show this particular thing here. Let me see if I can get it in the camera reasonably. So this structure right here is a harmonic diagram. It's very difficult to see. I know the camera probably doesn't reproduce it well. Even in the book, it's not reproduced all that well. But this diagram is used everywhere in Egyptian architecture, and it's not an accident. There's no chance of it being an accident. And this is one of the things that the Egyptologists are like, yeah, nah, it's just making stuff up.
yeah,
It's like, well, you could go measure the stuff, and you'd see it everywhere. So I find these things very fascinating. But the thing that I was saying earlier, hieroglyphs are a very peculiar and fascinating aspect of writing. And the thing that I think is lost on most people when they try to think about this is the concept of making shapes that change light. When you do that, you're doing something that's not merely magical, it's transcendental to thought. It's not a thinking thing, right? You are actually shaping the fundamental sort of being, that from which all things derive their origin and form. You're shaping that, and you're shaping it to be received not just by human eyes, right? We presume that all these things were just made for humans. It's not that way. So there's something fundamentally transcendental to rationality going on here. And when rationality gets a hold of it, it just tries to dismiss it. Like, yeah, it's not important. They're just blah blah blah. Um, and when you shape, it doesn't have to be letters, right? It can be images. It can be physical structure with wood or metal or stone or whatever it is your medium is. You're shaping matter. You're doing the same thing that the gods, whatever humans might mean by that, do. So there's something very profound here that we should bear in our awareness when we pursue these matters, I think. How did you first become aware of these matters with alphabets? And particularly, how did you find your way into thinking about Akkadian? Well, tell me the background, like give me the backstory there, Will.
Well, some of the so the backstory on the door that I carved was that we've had actually a lot of interesting guests here, and it's one of the more interesting things about being an innkeeper is that random people come with very interesting perspectives. You would never know to look at them or imagine what you could never guess anyone's occupation. So we've had people that cut down trees in the into the Panama Canal at 90 feet down. That's a weird occupation. Just all sorts of strange things. And fairly early on, because we're near the Monroe Institute, which I'd never heard of before, even though I heard of it, but no one locally in the county knows what they do. But then we had a guy show up, and I didn't know who he was, but he started telling me about, because we have this nice map that we just gotten, I think just before he got there, and I said, well, it'd be cool if people put their stickers where they're from, and we could talk about travels and things like that. And so his wife, he actually wasn't feeling that well the first night, and his wife started telling me about all the places that they'd been and where she was from. And so the person was Graham Hancock and his wife.
Uh,
And I didn't know who he was at the time. This was in 2017.
right.
I'd never heard of him,
Uh-huh.
had no clue. And then the next morning, he proceeded to tell me, about finding the lost ark and all of his other. He's been to almost every country and looked at so many immense things. And there was another guest who'd been there several other times, and she was an English professor at a university, and she was working on a book. And so when Graham got up and left after breakfast to go, I guess they went to the Monroe Institute. She was like, well, who is this guy? Because she was fascinated by him talking as well. And I said, well, I said his name. And so she looked him up on the, Wikipedia. And she looked at me, and, this is an English professor. She goes, what's a pseudoscientist? And Wikipedia was so cruel to him. Nothing he told me was wrong. He'd just actually come back from Russia and went to the Denisovan caves and interviewed the guy that discovered these things. I'd never heard the word before in my life, and he's pointing to the map exactly where these caves were, where he'd just come from. And everything he told me, nothing was speculative. We didn't talk about Atlantis, but everything that he told me was just here's my travels, and this is what I've seen, and just fascinatingly energetic and very complimentary of the work that I did. And I do custom weird doors. I do lots of them and have different themes. And so just very nice. And his wife was just so amazingly nice. It's the one thing that I tell people is like, yeah, he gets a lot of cruelty from the Egyptologists, but his wife is so nice that you really can't feel sorry for him, that, she's, and then of course they go on to call him later on. I'm watching different things like Joe Rogan and other things, and he's on there, and they're very critical of him, and they call him racist and other things, and he's clearly, it's all just made up to try to detract from his. And I see much of this.
It's the which fallacy is that, right? The straw man fallacy. Don't examine the claims, just attack the person.
I see that kind of parallel with him, and to some way with Ammon getting the same kind of criticizing the person and not looking at either his translations are right or they're not right, or you think this should be changed or this should be more accented. Okay, whatever, but why pick on him, personally?
I mean, I would distinguish between Graham and Ammon in a specific way. So Graham is, in my view, a profoundly insightful, intelligent, brilliant, actually. He's a prodigy, but he's a scholar. And Hillman is a weirder thing.
He's a different animal, but
Hillman is much more like a prophet. Hillman's a prophet, right? That's his game, in my view. I'm not saying he would agree or that anyone should agree with me. But Hillman Hillman is possessed, right? He's possessed. He'll straight up tell you that he sold his soul, right? He's a possessed human being, and he's possessed almost by the spirits of ancient Greece. Yeah, he's like an avatar or something, right? In my view. Or at least that's one way to view him. If people want to just examine him as a scholar, I'm sure they can find lots to complain about. That doesn't really bother me because he just seems like a very different animal to me. Hillman is a transcendental thing, right? He's like a monster or a Medusa,
yeah,
right? He's really something, but he's not a regular scholar. Hill Hancock's a scholar and he's brilliant. And they've risked their lives. I mean, they've done incredible like dives off of Japan and other places, him and his wife. They put their lives on the line to try to understand, to see through the lie of the academic fictions. So I think he's wildly heroic. It's astonishing that Wikipedia, it's not really Wikipedia that's the problem. It's the academy, right? In that case, it's the academy. But that's fascinating. Okay, so you met Hancock and his wife, and you were introduced to the Monroe Institute. How did things go after? What happened next?
so I met the I guess it's the daughter of Bob Monroe came here to meet with me and kind of get a little tour of the place, and she invited me to go there at some point. So that was after Graham Hancock had left and so forth. So he stayed, but each morning he just had his an hour long talk about just some of the most like he'd been everywhere. He'd been shot at over Ethiopia in the airplanes, and just I was like, this is like, and he didn't even cover like a tenth of what the things that he's done, but just his adventure, like any subject you could come up with, he could just go and I realized I had to be more interesting. So I realized that there was there's levels to this game.
Hmm.
And when I was younger, a younger, fitter person, I used to do uh, powerlifting and
Hmm.
competed and did very well. But there's my ego coming out, But I met this Russian guy in a gym long ago, and I was, I lifted my certain ways, and I had and he came over and asked me for a spot, and he didn't look that big, but I was like, okay. And he goes over the squat rack, and he has 500 pounds in the bar. I'm like, I don't know what this guy's going to even do. He takes like 6 steps back into the middle of the gym away from the squat rack and starts doing what are called good mornings, where you bend down and go vertical with your back or horizontal with your back and then back up. And I was like, who are you? What is this? And then I start talking to this guy, and he was raised from the age of 10 in the Olympic Training Center to be, he was this, and I learned so many things from him because he was operating at a different level, both mentally and physically. And suddenly my training went from, average gym bully to, being able to compete at a high level,
Hmm.
it's just it's a different mindset. And it's almost like picking up a disease from someone when you meet somebody at that level.
Hmm.
And I've heard other people say that with specifically Graham Hancock. When you have time with him like that, it's not that I went down the rabbit hole; I was pushed.
No, the
It,
rabbit hole comes inside you.
and so and so things that I didn't pay attention to before, it's there are people that change your ability to see things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think legitimately you're one of those people as well. So I would put you in that camp of what about, if you look at it this way and you're like, what? And you never experienced that there's different ways of just different ways of seeing things. It's part of why traveling is interesting as well. So it was after that I made that door. I was like, well, I make these doors, and I had never even heard of Göbekli Tepe. So this was 2017. I'm sure I had not heard the word Denisovan at that point or Göbekli Tepe in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt kind of betrayed by I think at that point I still watched, I think we still had satellite, and I would watch the History Channel, but the History Channel, it was dying at that point.
Mm.
And I felt betrayed by the History Channel to have not shown me these things.
Yeah.
And this was cutting edge stuff. I mean, he's getting into the most cutting edge stuff
Mm.
and giving it to people. And the academics who don't like him seem to think that they're should be the arbitrators of what's new and not, But I felt like, wait a minute, I'm not learning enough, and I really got from that point into investigating other things. But so making the door was more of an exercise in understanding it better, and then I would there's certain information that I would say I come up with, but other explanation would be it comes to me at 3:00 in the morning, fully formed.
I mean, does it ever occur to you, Will, that that information is not dead, and that it might seek out a person who could express it into the physical world?
I would believe that now, but I think at earlier times I would not.
Okay.
So that's
Yeah, because we have these weird ideas about like what information and knowledge are supposed to be and where they come from and stuff. But if you look at those ideas, they don't hold water very well at all. Also, I think it's fascinating what you say, because when you're exposed to somebody like Hancock, or you go to the Monroe Institute, there's something that occurs that I would call like the mixing of the waters, right? As if those places and those people, they have a certain kind of magic water, right? And you get some on you and you get some inside you and you can't help it. And it just changes who it's possible for you to become.
I think that's really I mean, that's the best way to describe things. That's why I was amazed how you just kind of sum things up. But yeah, I mean, when you get exposed to the ability to see, like, I don't know, it changed how I looked at, certainly at ancient history and other things. I have my, I have too much Jefferson knowledge. I could, I read a bunch of books about him while I was working there, and fully entrenched myself in him. But getting into other fields really just seeing other time periods and other things, and it's just like there's so much on that. And I became just an annoying 10-year-old that wanted to know how everything works and how everything happens. And
Good. Yeah. Good.
I think that's what he is. And it's very
Yeah.
good to you see somebody that he's just curious about everybody, very social, likes everybody, just kind of, what is this? How? And that's kind of how you should travel as well. You shouldn't go places and go, ew, why did they do that? But you're like, wow, that's the ugliest, weirdest looking motorcycle I've ever seen. How do I get, like, or you see somebody doing anything, and it's just, if it's different, it's exciting.
Yeah.
So that got me
Sorry, go ahead.
maybe using my mind a little bit more. But at some point, and this was on another vacation on the first day, I woke up with, and Graham talks about a bunch of different stuff, and I had read a book of his, but this was now several years after that, and I woke up with the idea fully explained to me, although I think there's an error in what I was told, that I discovered, but anyway, that if you look at a lotus, which is the Egyptian lotus, they open and close, and they do so. And I had no knowledge of this. There's no biology that I knew that would explain what I was understood. I have 10th grade biology. I don't have anything to express this, but the time clock of the lotus flower is not dependent on the sun. And that if you took one with you on a ship, it would answer the problem of longitude, because it would keep its time to the original place for which it grew.
Wow.
And you could compare it to wherever you were, because it's very easy to tell when noon is, but it's hard to tell when noon is in Cairo if you're 1,000 miles away. But the plant would know. Now, I began fascinated with that, and there's a woman, and I wrote her name down because I had to go look it up, because I didn't know if I would talk about this, but I couldn't even remember her name because it'd been so many years since I looked at this. Her name is Monica Gagliano, and I don't know in what weird research I found her, but she took mimosa plants and dropped them in a drop test and proved that over time they had a memory. So the mimosa plant will curl its leaves in response to stress. But if it gets repeated, and then even cuttings of that would remember that this event that she created was not stressful. And that they no longer reacted to this event, and even offspring. And then I looked up another guy who was a astronomer in France, and he is the inventor or creator, I guess, discoverer of the circadian rhythm. And he was a astronomer. In 1729, he did this experiment where he took a similar plant and put it in a cave, and noticed that it maintained its same pattern of opening and closing to the light, despite not having the light, and showed that there was something else in the plant that had a natural rhythm independent of seeing the sun.
Yep.
And that was and he didn't publish it because he thought it was too silly. And then his friend ended up publishing it for him, because he worried, I guess, that the astronomers would laugh at him for his study of plants. But it ends up being the foundation of what is, circadian rhythm. And it turns out, of course, we all have these natural rhythms, and that's why you get jet lag. And plants also get jet lag. And all the plants in the legume, the bean family, are particular with their rhythms. And so there was, I believe he was in Japan, a guy that was studying to see if you could alter the patterns of a soybean, because apparently it has a theoretical idea of how long a day should be in terms of the light. And then it measures it against the actual amount of light it gets, and that determines when it flowers and produces seeds. And he was trying to cheat that to shorten the growth cycle so that you could get beans sooner, and you could then get 4 crops instead of 3 or something like that. And so the plants have a certain innate intelligence, and clearly ancient people knew this, not just biologically for what it does to me and the mushrooms, but just that plants knew what was going on. And I started reading about, I'm not sure where I stumbled into this, but there was a Alexander the Great's, one of his generals wrote a book about plants. I should know. I don't remember his name now, but he mentions a tree that he finds, which every day curls up his leaves and opens them in the morning, and it's called the tamarind tree.
Mm.
And when I read about that, and it took. This is over a period of time. I said, "That's it. That's the plant," because I didn't think the lotus would last long enough to be useful in a sea voyage.
Right, right.
Then I went to the Richmond Museum when we have a fine arts museum which has some Egyptology stuff, and it has the wall of, it's a copy, but a copy of the wall for Queen Hatshepsut's fleet. If you could look that up at some point, and if you're going to talk to a hieroglyphics woman, perhaps you can profound her with these. I talked to this weird guy, and he thinks that if you look at the images, what the Egyptologists say is happening in the images is not what's happening in the images.
Nope.
It's a whole wall. It's like 50 feet long and 30 feet high, and it shows them loading a boat with these plants that are about 6 feet tall. And they say that, at least the Egyptologists say that that she went to essentially Eritrea, which is a day's walk away if you were going to just hoof it. It's not that, it's the next country down, and brought back some myrrh trees for her eyeshadow. That is the conventional version of this scene that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. Now they're loading baboons and other things. It's quite an involved story, but it seemed to me that they're using these trees because at the end of the story, picture-wise, the trees have 3 splits in their branches and are considerably larger. So it was a long voyage. It seems to indicate that they were gone for 3 years. And it might be, it may not be, but it might be that they were using these. Why else would you transport 6-foot-high shrubberies onto your ship? So my theory is, if you took them and had them on the deck and covered, if you had, let's say 6 of them, and covered 2 of them, the difference in time, because eventually the other ones are going to adjust to their time, having been exposed to the sun. So they'll get over it, but the other one, the one in shade, will maintain its jet lag and be different. And the difference would tell you how far you are from your point of origin.
I see, yes.
There's a bunch of maps that people, and I didn't really get into the maps when I heard about it. I was like, well, whatever. But they claim that they had Antarctica and other, there's claims of earlier maps,
right,
showing details that even Columbus would not have been able to convey.
Yeah, this is something Hancock's onto as well.
And so that it's a kind of wild theory that
it's not very wild
put forward, but
it might seem superficially this way or that way, but the ancient peoples, particularly the Egyptians, who we know about because they left us enough stuff to look at, they were aware of time in a very different way than we are. And they synchronized their relationships. Your story about the lotus is fascinating. I was unaware of that. And it's the first thing I thought was, oh, God's a lotus maker, not a watchmaker. He makes lotuses. Yeah.
Like, the lotus is a clock. It does everything.
Go ahead.
Well, the lotus is within it a computer that does everything that your.
That's my point.
Your Harrison clock is doing the same thing.
Yeah, except you're your clock won't relate with you and a lotus will, right? A lotus is a living being, right? A clock is just an object. I mean, there's so much to say here. I've studied how organisms hitchhike on each other's synchronization and activity. And by studied, I mostly mean reflect on, and in some ways, excuse me, inquire into. But there's something else I want to ask you about, and perhaps we can wrap up fairly soon, though I'd be happy to have another conversation sometime with you. And I very much enjoy that. This door thing. Did I understand you correctly to say that you make doors?
Well, I built if you go to my inn, I built the entire inn.
Yes,
And
that I'm
so,
aware of.
one of the things that I did while I was coming up with the plan and so forth, and I started building. So I built doors for like a historic place or something like that. I could make a door in different time periods. I could make it, the Dutch built this and they did the joinery this way, or the English did it this way.
Really?
Yeah. So I
Really?
mean, but within the time period that I colonial America time period.
Hmm.
So I would consider myself at least knowledgeable in those kinds of things. And, there's different tools that come in. So the technology of the time it's evolving in that time period. To me, I mean, I obviously found it interesting enough to work in that for a long time. So that was my little niche of what I did. But then I wanted to make doors that I'd never seen before, because I wanted to create things that I liken it to music, not necessarily that I always have to explain to people that I'm not that great at music. But when I was doing the work at a museum, it was classical music, and now I do jazz.
Mm.
In other words, and then people will question, and I said it took a little while to learn how to do jazz style building, or it's kind of like when I would build things, I had to think about how much Dr. Seuss do you want? Not so much that it looks like, you have to have a little bit of play to it.
Mm.
It won't look handmade if you didn't if it's too perfect, it's wrong. And it has to do with the Japanese wabi sabi concept. But it occurs in other things. I used to call it colonial funk when I was working at museums. But how funky should it be to be believably handmade? Even though you could make it perfect, if you did, everyone would think a machine did it.
Right.
And that's where the machines have ruined many trades, because the silversmith used to do that too. He's like, I could make it round, but I can't sell it. So he has to have it a little bit rough. And we would knock the corners off our planes to leave marks intentionally.
Wow. To humanize it.
Well, to leave tool marks, because the tool, you see a similar thing that happened in the art world when photography came in. You had to have, it wasn't enough to be accurate. That wasn't artistic anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Painting accurately was great when there were no cameras.
Mm.
But now you had a machine that can do it perfectly. You have to come up, you have to have brush strokes now. You have to have abstraction. You have to have Picasso. And he was going back to the expression of what he thought was the earliest. He was looking backwards to see what the earliest people were painting, and he wanted that emotion. He really liked the cave paintings when they found those in France.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that was the bait, that was as good as it could get.
Mm.
Because it's like you can see the artist in it. You can see the hand of the maker.
Yeah.
And if it's too perfect, you've lost that feel. And so if you're going to make a forgery or a reproduction, I'll call it that way. But if you're going to make any of these forgeries, they always have to recreate the time period
Mm-hmm.
that you're trying to create. So if you go to Colonial Williamsburg, it wasn't all built in 1780 because I built some of it. And so, and then, other people built a lot of, so a lot of it's post 1930
Mm-hmm.
that you'll see, but it's done in a way that you will generally not know it.
Mm-hmm.
And it does reflect back into language that I think that's where Hebrew comes back around again, where it's a reproduction or recreation of earlier languages.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's the language of the time. I think it's the language of what they felt was apparently closer to the gods or God or whatever. A way
To
to,
origin.
yeah, going back to the original kind of sense of the Tower of Babylon.
Mm. The store thing. I mean, are you familiar with the Greek idea of Janus, the two-faced god, sits above the doorways, one face on one side, another face on the other?
I haven't looked into that much, no.
Yeah, because the door, I mean, to make a door is a very transcendental thing to do, right? It's both the closure and the opening kind of between two worlds.
Well, for me, it was my two sides of my brain having a conflict because the creative side of my brain had been suppressed, and the engineer side of the brain, the architect side of the brain, looked at art and said, if it's on a wall, it has no job. It's unemployed. It has no function.
Wow, yeah.
And so if it was in a door, it has a job.
I
Or if it's
see, I see. So it's not just the conflict, this is where they come together as well.
it's my internal conflict between the two sides. And it took me a while of making doors to get to the point where I was like, I could do this just on a wall. It doesn't have to open or close. It doesn't have to move. But there are people who have that, like, it has to have function or utility because they're it's like, and we get that. I get that with different guests when they ask me, they'll ask me all sorts of questions about, how did you come up with this? Or why did you, they have these questions. And there are certain people who are artistic or poetic,
Mm-hmm.
and they see that right away. They like, oh, wow, yeah, they see that just as clear as can be. And there's other people that will ask you questions like about what's your ROI, or they'll ask you numbers about these financial things. And I've told some of them to no probably use, but perhaps maybe so. I don't know. I've been, it's like, yes, but if you design everything by efficiency, you get a place no one wants to stay.
Yeah, it's
You
dead
have
inside.
you
Yeah,
have to have. I was like, you have to have both because it has to work
yeah,
as a business, but
sure.
it also has to be something that if you just you know if it's too manufactured, it's too efficient. You see that with older businesses where they get too pragmatic with their approach and they go out of business
Mm-hmm.
because they're
No, I
no
mean,
longer.
fundamentally, we are animals, and so if there's something in the space that feels uncomfortable, we will not want to be there. And what makes comfort may be different for different people, but there's got to be a kind of an organic familiarity, I think, in shape and character and color and all kinds of things, right? The lighting, everything matters. Yeah.
And
No,
so that
I'm
was,
I'm I'm quite worried about the utilitarian aspect because it's dangerously overemphasized in most of our experience. But
and
yeah,
it's like
both things are necessary.
the danger of AI becoming too, uh,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole we'll have to preserve for another time. But yeah, I mean I was studying. I started to first think about AI in 1981 when I was a very young man and starting to play with computers. I've been following that for a long time, but yeah, it's extremely dangerous. It might be the most dangerous thing, although the invention of automobiles is way up there, and along with guns and so forth, prisons are a really terrifying thing as well.
but it's so the doors were kind of a way to open up, I guess metaphorically, my own brain on
Mm.
a way to express things in a way that was still pragmatic.
Yeah, I love that. The Hebrew letter bait uh, is the letter that represents house. It's also, the thing that we pick to say it represents tells more about us than it does the letter. But it's very much like a room, which is also very much like a womb. And the door is determines who enters the room, the womb, who doesn't, when they do or don't. Um, in a way, to pass through a doorway is to be reincarnated or reborn, because the space inside the room transforms us and we transform it by entering and living within it, right? So that door is a very profound transcendental object if we reflect on that in any deep way.
And
Um,
also so the letter D is the door.
mhm.
In a lot of
Dalet,
languages, D is the door.
yeah.
And the reason it's a triangle is that it's from a tent door. So it was from people that were moving.
Mm,
And if you think about a door, it doesn't open the way a door today would open. It's a square because it's a triangle. It actually opens and goes up. And it would be hinged on the right hand side so that as you left, you would be pushing it with your left hand. As you left the tent, you'd be opening it with your left hand because you might have a knife in your right hand to defend yourself, just like in the castles, they were spiraled in a direction so that you were fighting at an advantage.
wow.
So
Yeah,
the
that's
so the
powerful.
door so the door when it's paired, the letter D is paired with the letter R, and I denote it for my own sake. When it's a paired version of R, I use the lowercase. It's it's a little weird to explain at first, but it makes sense to me.
Hmm.
So when D is interacting with R, I know that the door is open. It's a different door than when it's interacting with the letter N. And I know the letter is N when I write it in a lowercase. As an interactive N. I know it's an end. It's it's
Mm.
it's N. D and N are enclosed.
Mm-hmm.
You might bind something or bond, or there's ways that
Mm-hmm.
that the door is closed,
I see, yes.
and D with R is open. And then I realized that the N and the R can be applied to the letter K, and I can have K with R or K with N. And so if I go like into Japanese, a fist is Ken, K-N. Kendo is the sword grabbing.
Mm-hmm.
Knife, again, I'm grabbing. In this
Mm-hmm.
case, the P is a stick, and that's only in the English. And in all other languages, it ends up being usually a stone instead of a stick with the letter differences.
Mm.
But it turns out that actually the word dagger is related to the word dogwood, which used to be daggerwood, and they would make the English would make knives out of this hard wood because they didn't have a lot of metalworking at the time. So and you can get a very good sharp edge on a piece of dogwood or daggerwood, as it was called. That was what they would make the English short sword with. A dagger is actually wooden
Wow.
in England, and our word knife has the different letter than I believe in the Hebrew. It's siken, so we have S and K, but that could be the Arabic. I've looked at too many languages, but you have the S K N, so you're grabbing a stone,
Mm-hmm.
and it a lot of times the word order or letter order is almost irrelevant in a word, and I started seeing that in Hebrew, particularly. I was watching a show that was supposed to help me learn Hebrew, and it was a
Mm.
flashcard type thing. And they
Mm.
would show you the Hebrew as it's written in Hebrew. Then they would show you what it sounded like phonetically.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that reverses the order. It's important, but and then they would tell you what that word means.
Okay.
And I'm eating breakfast or whatever I'm doing and trying to multitask, and I see this word, and I'm trying to understand a little bit of Hebrew, and I see, oh, I like the letter shin, the sh sound. It's a good one. It's my favorite, and
Mm.
I see that and I go, oh, that's that, and I go, I think the next one is R, and I look and I think that's the K, because the letters are hard to learn at first,
Mm.
and I go SRK. I was like, I learned a word. That's got to be shark. God damn it, I'm sure of it. And then the next section comes up and it goes Karish. I'm like, oh, I read it backwards. And then it shows me the meaning of Karish, shark. And I'm like, wait a minute. And so if you take out the vowels, the word reverses. And it's the same word as shark. And I'm like, what is it was one of those things that made me look at words differently. So there's a lot of mirrored words, and so you have in the Akkadian, a chief is a rab, R-A-B, although we don't actually know the vowels in any of these. Just
Mm-hmm.
and in the Hebrew, it's bar,
Mm-hmm.
except they also have rabbi,
Mm-hmm.
which is chief.
Right. Yeah, I see. This all makes fundamental sense to me.
So there's mirrored
Beside,
letters or mirrored words that, like Karish and shark, if you take all the vowels out, it's just they're mirroring the same
mm-hmm,
concepts,
I
and yet
see.
they would tell you they're unrelated and from different families,
Right.
and
Right.
no one from here. And then you can go into you can do that with a bunch of different words, and even into the Egyptian, into the words, their words, and you're like, well, how come that looks like English to me? Hey, wait a minute, this can't be. And
Mm.
so there's certain things that make sense when you look at it, even though they shouldn't be related.
Mhm. Yeah, well, the idea of should and shouldn't again comes mostly from people who don't want to look. And if you don't go looking for something, then you won't see it. And if you don't see it, then what? You'll decide it doesn't exist. I don't know. It's just, it's really weird. Again, it's a problem, not so much necessarily with rationality itself, but with I don't know. I don't know where the actual problem comes from. It exists all over the world, so it can't just be American, but it's uniquely instanced in different places. Um, some of it has to do with thinking style, right? Just we're taught a thinking style that is garbage, or we're so poorly educated, as most people in America are, that our capacity for any kind of um, insightful thinking is minimal at best.
And so
But yeah, those, please.
Jefferson actually noticed this, and I never paid attention to this, but there were a couple of quirks that Jefferson had linguistically
Hmm.
that I reflect on now, but kind of ignored at the time. There were just things that, okay, whatever. And so one of the things is that he told Lewis and Clark to learn a few Hebrew phrases because
Really?
he noticed that there were Hebrew words in certain Native American languages, and
Ah,
he wondered if out west was somebody that actually just spoke some Hebrew. He's wondering how these words got there. And most
wow.
people see that as silly, but the more I looked at it, I could find you Hebrew words, but they're not necessarily Hebrew words. They're words that conform to the pattern,
Mm-hmm.
and they exist particularly in different tribes throughout South America, North America. Um, the word for water keeps being something with an M, ama, or some other version throughout South America. The different languages throughout Africa. It just pops up, and you could say, well, that sounds very. You can see it in Hawaiian and other things. You can keep seeing these same patterns where words look vaguely Hebrew. Not exactly Hebrew, but
Yeah,
vaguely
that's
Hebrew.
true.
And he was seeing that. And the other thing he did was he began translating the Bible from Greek, and he gets partway through. And I've always been curious which part since I started watching Ammon, but
Hmm.
at some point Jefferson takes the Bible, the Greek Bible, and he says enough of this, and he takes a pair of scissors to the King James Bible and starts cutting it. And he cuts out the passages that are basically, I guess, religious people would say is the Q document, or just the teachings of Jesus, and none of the woo, none of the other stuff.
Hmm.
But a bit. I don't think most people would say you should take a pair of scissors to a Bible and start cutting out the parts that you like. But that's the Jefferson Bible, and I've always been curious when what he saw when he was translating the Greek that got him to the point. I don't know what chapter he was on when he said enough of this.
Hmm.
But it makes me wonder if he saw something like Ammon sees a lot of stuff in there that I don't know enough Greek to speculate on these things. But
I mean, it seems unlikely. I think Ammon's understanding of Greek is peculiar, and probably deeply influenced by readings of Nonus and Galen and others, right? I doubt many people have looked much at Galen. I doubt many moderns have looked much at Galen. And Ammon seems to think very highly of the contributions of Galen and Nonus, particularly also Aeschylus is a little more commonly read. So I think it's my sense that Ammon has read some stuff that common people just haven't seen. And it'd be wildly unlikely that Jefferson had seen any of that stuff, but it's conceivable, I suppose. I have no idea what he was reading or where he
and
was
so
getting it.
and then the other day I was looking up something, and I found it quite, I guess, in Almond's ballpark of things. So I don't know if you know what our state flag of Virginia looks like.
Not off the top of my head, I don't.
So and I never paid much attention, but I looked at that the other day, and I was like, what? That's a Scythian woman. And so there's a woman, one left breast exposed, and she's standing on top of what is depicted sort of as a person with a crown, and I was like, huh, that's weird. And I said, I wonder who designed that, when that was even designed. And of course, it was George Wythe. And George Wythe was Thomas Jefferson's law professor, among other things, and also signer of the Declaration. And so this was his design, and he labels her as an Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a strange scene, but it's very much the they read a lot of classics. They read a lot of classics in Greek, and so he's putting that in there, and it's like, and of course his story becomes very strange because he's actually poisoned by his grandnephew in the tea. So
Mm.
he's killed by poison and obsessed with this Scythian woman, and it's kind of interesting what they thought of um, these sorts of things, because clearly they read a lot. I mean, they were reading a lot of. They weren't reading Galen, but they were fairly aware of a lot of stuff that, I guess, growing up, we don't learn Greek, and they were reading Greek, reading Plato in Greek, and I believe Seneca and some other things that he was into, but he liked this idea of this Scythian woman, scantily clad on his flag, and it kind of was interesting that it came back into a lot of things come back into Jefferson's life, at least for me. And so when you see, we talked briefly about the precession of the equinox and the Hamlet's Mill stuff. So Thomas Jefferson's birthday changes in 1752 by 11 days when they reset the calendar. And again,
Wow.
when I used to know that as just a fact that his birthday switches to the 13th of April, 1743. But then I was puzzled why George Washington's birthday changes from 1731 to 1732 in the same year, as well as adding 11 days to his birthday. But I never put it together with the precession of the equinox. So over a period of time, the spring was moving because they were using a year as being the time it took for the Earth to go around the sun. And what happens is that every 72 years, spring gets a day earlier. And so the equinox was around the 10th, I think, at that point. And so to push it back to the 21st, they added 11 days in 1 year. And then for whatever reason, people changed their birthday to the new calendar birthday. And they also changed the beginning of the year from March to January.
Wow.
And so George Washington's birthday changed by a year. And so instead of being born in the 12th month, he was then born in the second month of the year. And his birthday goes from the 11th to the 22nd. And his birth year goes from 1731 to 1732.
Weird.
But
Wow. I knew nothing of this.
all that mathematics that they did at that point was to readjust the calendar. And that's the same mathematics that the Egyptians were doing. And I think at Göbekli Tepe, they were aware of this as well, that every 72 years, you gotta change the days or else spring starts moving, or, they were aware of these things. And the fact that it just comes into, there's a lot of weird stuff that comes back into Jefferson's, I don't know, life, and probably in other people's lives as well, if you looked at them. So I don't know. I try to bring everything back into poor Mr. Jefferson and make sense of it that way. But it's my paradigm of analysis. But he did look at language and saw. He didn't look at as many languages, but he saw this pattern was there, and it made him curious. So he was aware of it.
Do you think, to some degree, you caught it from him? Or did it
No,
really
I
start?
don't. I mean,
When did it really start?
It only started when I tried to figure out what the letter K was. And then when I realized that the letter K was the hand, and it was very similar to the numbers that were being used, that I was like, I wonder if other letters also correspond to some things. And I started, some of them are fairly well known, and some of them are not.
Why K?
It was similar to the hand on the door that I was doing.
Hmm.
It's I don't know. It just, the K was the first one that I made sense of.
It's funny because the Vulcan symbol, right, for live long and prosper. This actually comes from synagogue. This is
Right.
something that the priests used to summon the Shekinah, right? But it's very K-like, although it's usually pointed up.
Well, it's actually, I would say, is the SH symbol.
Yeah.
It is the symbolic in the Hebrew, they're representing that in the shape of their letter for the shin is 3 points.
Oh, right. Yeah, I
And
see.
so when I got into looking at the Hawaiian the Hawaiian language fascinated me endlessly. So when I started looking at Hawaiian, there's some weird things that show up in the Hawaiian. One of course, is they use the shaka, but it is actually making a 3-pointed symbol as well. And what fascinated me the most about that is that there's no letter S in the Hawaiian. And yet they have this word, which is clearly with the letter S. And then I looked up their word for snake, and it's nahesa. And again, I already knew they had no letter S, and I said, "There's something up with this. Where did they get this from?" And I started looking at when did the Hawaiian language come into being, and it comes into being a written language in 1822. This is a very big year. It's the same year that they decipher the Champollion deciphers the Egyptian. Now, 1 year later, and the guy who did it was Elijah Loomis, and he is from upstate New York. And I told my mother this story because I have to tell her things, and she said, "Is that in the same area as Joseph Smith?" And I said, "I don't know anything about Joseph Smith." And I look up Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith allegedly translated his golden tablets in 1823, a year after Champollion discovers how to decipher Egyptian. Suddenly he's doing it. And it's just a few miles down the road from where this missionary who goes to what were at the time called the Sandwich Islands of Hawaii, who goes and makes their written language for them. He was only like 20 years old when he did it. And he was trying to translate the Bible into Hawaiian. And he basically was the only one to preserve the language of Hawaiian. Otherwise, it probably would be completely lost. And he goes there, and he clearly is translating from the Hebrew, not because he uses Nahash, which is a snake.
Yes, in Hebrew.
They don't have snakes. They don't have snakes in Hawaii, so they don't need a word for snake.
Oh, that's what I was thinking. Actually, as you were speaking, I was like, do they even have snakes? Like, why did they need a word for it?
And so they don't even have the letter S in his language. They only have like 8 consonants, and S is not one of them. And when you start looking at how he had to create their language, but he's trying to do it to fit the Bible translation. So he makes a Hawaiian Bible. His father is some sort of, I guess, printer in upstate New York, not that far from Joseph Smith's little place. And just the coincidence of the timing is fascinating, because you have all of this language stuff happening around the world in the same year. Even discounting Joseph Smith, who I would say is a coattail follower of something that was in the news at the time. You know, when they suddenly deciphered these Egyptian tablets, he's like, well, maybe I can. So the next year he's doing it, but it's the same year that languages all around the world were being translated or first written down, probably usually to make a biblical translation by some sort of, you know, so throughout Africa, the Maori was the same year. So missionaries were going out and kind of trying to compile languages of native people. A lot of Native American languages were first written down about that same time period too.
Wow.
And prior to that, no one seemed to care about language that much. It was kind of weird.
Yeah, well, once you're going to try to convert people to your strange religion, then you need to be able to have. I mean, whenever I see any indigenous people and they're carrying a book, I'm like, oh God, no, please help me, because you know what's coming next, right? Like,
So it's weird stuff that shows up in language that if it suddenly makes, because that's clearly, you know, it's like, well, how did Hebrew get to Hawaii? And that's
yeah.
you know, that's the journey of that, just that one word. But you find a lot of other weird coincidences when I look through things, and that kind of, I don't know, it's like a Sudoku puzzle that I enjoy or something. Is to
No, I mean, I think there's something. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but our souls, our spirit, it finds likenesses in the estranged graveyard of human behavior and activity. And in a way, it seeks its awakening through these reflections. And the origins of language have to do with matters that are fundamentally transcendental to rational thought. So that's a perfect place for the soul to play, to recover itself, to remember its nature, it seems to me.
wow. See, you get it much more than yeah. No, it's there's clearly a pattern. There's clearly the thumbprint, and when you, particularly when you look at the Native American stuff, the timeline would be, oh, they've been over isolated for 10,000 years from, you know, contact,
That's a guess. We don't know
whatever.
that. We don't know
But
if they were isolated.
then you get these recurrent patterns again, and it's the same thumbprint.
Mhm.
And you know, I don't know if it means that we have a common origin of language or a common um, contact with something that is forming language over and over again, where people are picking up language, the concept of language from some other realm, I guess, if that makes sense.
Does it to me.
Yeah, no, that's the hard part to explain, because that becomes the, you know, you have to. There was somebody that was doing, I think it was cave paintings, and found that there's imagery in the caves, and she found that they were all from around the world, from different times, and they all had basically the same set of like 32 different patterns repeated,
Right. Right.
and yet they probably didn't have direct contact physically with each other, but somehow are. And then when you get, you know, I've never done the DMT stuff, but Graham Hancock said, I think he told me he'd done it 72 times, not to be symbolic, but that
Hmm.
he did ayahuasca 72 times when he told me about that. It's a very good number either way, but there's a common, when people paint, when they're on the ayahuasca, they paint the same set of images. And
Yeah, I mean, this brings up another thing that I'll just mention, and then we should probably wrap up for now.
okay.
I need to get some food, but if you are in a place where there are trees, and if you are in the sunlight, there are two things that should become relatively obvious fairly quickly, but they aren't. The first is that there is always a rainbow. If you look at the sun through the branches of a tree, you will see circular rainbow that is scintillating. It's very profound. It's always there. And, you know, people think, oh, rainbows, it's a thing with the water. No, no, it's a thing with trees, right? The water thing is vastly more rare and fascinating, but there's one every single moment that you're near a tree. And clearly people were aware of this. It's a very profound thing. I encourage you to take a moment and try to see one sometime soon. It's really, when people talk about drug experiences and stuff, that can be fascinating sometimes, but they should look at things that are immediately apparent that they don't see, right? And this is one of them. There is always a rainbow if the sun is behind a tree branch, especially certain times of year. It's much more profound, and it's really different from anything you'd expect from a rainbow. It's alive, right? It's coruscating inside the colors. It's just amazing. But the second thing is that if you are walking through woods and there is bright light, it leaves phosphenes. It makes phosphene after images on the iris. And these are going to be the same for everybody around the world. To get a little more esoteric about it, I believe that it's become formally demonstrated that our eyes emit photons, and they emit photons onto the backs of the eyelids when they're closed. This produces the phenomenon we call phosphenes, which you can see if you just close your eye and press on it gently. You don't want to hurt your eye. Right after time, you'll start to see patterns. And those patterns are going to be the same pretty much around the world. They may differ slightly in different peoples, because in different peoples, the eye develops differently. It's not just like everyone has the same thing. That's the academic fiction. Oh, yeah, we're all humans. It's all the same everywhere. No, there's nothing like that going on. The eye is very similar, but in different places, it develops differently. So there's so much to explore and discover if we're curious, right? Because we've been buried in academic fictions, and there's lots of them that we shouldn't dismiss, but neither should we consider them authoritative.
Interesting. Well, I guess fairly recently told by her that we about genetics, that we don't have just a mother and a father. We have an X and a Y and an M. So we have, you're related to your father by a percent, your mother by a percent, and your mother's 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 mother's. So that there's
Yeah, yeah,
actually,
the mitochondrial DNA comes from the matrilineal line,
and
but it's not.
and
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, and what was interesting about that, and it was much more information than that, but our DNA can evolve out outstripping our RNA's ability, or the mitochondrial ability to keep up with it.
Hmm. I'm
And
not
that,
sure what that could mean. I mean, those two things are so intimately linked
in
that it's
terms
kind
of,
of.
there's a lot more evolution going on in your nucleus. Chromosomes can jump back and forth, and your mitochondria hasn't evolved. And so there's and this is a lot of this stuff was stuff that I don't have backgrounds in, but I just am explaining what I have been informed about. We've evolved uh, different different enzymes than our fairly recent ancestors,
Hmm.
and So one of those enzymes is amylase.
Hmm.
I've had to look up some of this stuff, but the bulk of the example is the same feature has happened to dogs. So a wolf has two amylase genes in the first position. Don't ask me how I know this, but they do. And I've looked that up. But a Labrador has as many as 16 mutations or 14 more mutations. And what happens is that the first position is pancreatic amylase.
Mm.
The second position, if there's a mutation and you have four, it goes in the second pair causes a doubling of the pancreatic amylase. The third position causes saliva amylase, and most animals don't have that, but humans do, and
Mm.
dogs do also. And then the fourth, which is if you had eight pairs, would be the fourth position, doubles the amount of saliva amylase, which gets broken down in your stomach anyway after you've swallowed, but it's pre-digestion ability of your mouth.
I see.
And this is where it probably gets beyond scientific knowledge, but the fifth position is because of the insertion a fold. So the 10th pairs are inactivated, and then it reverses backwards. And so
I follow.
it's an offshoot of the DNA because it's adding segments into kind of a little spike,
Hmm.
and the end is not active. And the problem with that is that it it has made dogs have the DNA of a vegetarian, but the mitochondria of a wolf. It still has the wolf mitochondria, has not changed.
Hmm.
And so the uh, so anyway, it shows that there's a difference between what is an adaptation of one part of our body and not the other part of the same cell. And this disparity is what causes the metabolic issues that are existing, including cancer.
Hmm.
So that the wolf is still in the lab in its mitochondria, and if it's eating this new diet that it can eat because of its new enzymes, it is overstraining the mitochondria of the wolf.
Hmm. Fascinating.
And none of these thoughts are anything that I would put. It's not my field to dispute.
No,
So
but you've become curious about it, and so you found you have sought out some information and forged some understanding around it.
and then it's more of the afterwards of trying to figure out what this nonsense that I've been, or whatever it has been. You have information, and then you then try to make sense of it.
It's true. Who was the woman that introduced you to the concepts around the genome? Did I
Which
misunderstand you?
Oh, no, that was just information that we'll call her, I don't know, the muse, whatever you want
Oh, I
to.
see. Okay.
That's why I say it's not anything that I have any explanation of.
I see.
But just the idea, I don't know, you're talking about our genetic makeup, I guess, in
Hmm.
nature.
Yeah.
But these are strange to some people thoughts that you have to then kind of put into the world of
Well, you organize them in relationship to some concern, right? Yeah, this is what happens. We organize percepts into concepts, something like this.
But I think most people think it should happen the other way, with that you have a bunch of data and you come to a conclusion.
I mean, with the questions that really matter, for me, I tend to avoid conclusions. There's a better perspective available for inquiry than the one that I'm used to. So a conclusion is the end of a relationship with a question. It's like getting a divorce from your wife. And I tend to get married to the big questions, so not looking for a conclusion myself. Though I understand that people like to put concerns to rest, right? Otherwise, they may find them troubling.
Interesting.
Will, I'm so grateful to you for this time we've had together today and for your work and your curiosity and your passion. Um, it's just been amazing to learn with you. I'm just super happy about this. So
Well,
I hope we may, I hope we may have another conversation sometime soon.
yeah, I hopefully I'll have new things. I like the idea of that it's a ongoing conversation rather than coming to a conclusion.
Me too. Thank you, my friend. It's great to meet you.
Well, thank you.
I'll see you another time soon, and
Yep.
I wish you every good thing over there in Virginia.
Well, I look forward to your next interviews as well with the Egyptologists. And
Thank you, my friend. Bye bye for now.
bye.